proposition speech is highly rhetorical, yet they have only proven to you this from a flight of a best case scenario that they haven't really taken account what Indonesia actually looks like in status quo. Here's a few pieces of clarification before I move on into my responses. Proposition's framing on Indonesia only took into account one thing: students are poor and scholarships are scarce. Proposition was so best case scenario and described Indonesia as every other developed country. Let me contextualize this better for you. Indonesia is a developing country with scarce government funding. Indonesia's politics and economic activities are relatively new, hence, it is relatively still unstable without a strong foundation yet. Let's talk about status quo. Indonesia is in major debt because of many factors currently, especially because of the volatile geopolitical condition. In fact, rupiah itself has gone up to 17,500. This shows to you panels the reality of Indonesia as a struggling developing country that proposition tried to hide from her speech. Let's move on to my responses. Notice that proposition implicitly told you that middle-income people go to university to climb up the social ladder. That's what they want. Here's why this doesn't actually happen in reality. Notice that Indonesia is a highly populated country with scarce job opportunities because of the background of the country by struggling economically. When you open student loans, you invite a myriad of these low-income people or middle-income people to go to college and find a job later on. Here's the problem. Indonesia's job demands are already oversaturated to begin with. When you let more people in, you only exacerbate it. Without context, this sounds good. You make people competitive. But when you require these people to get a loan and expect them to pay back to the government, the likelihood of them having the capacity to pay is exponentially low. That is to say that when you have a tight demand on resources, the ones who get in jobs are privileged ones that have good pedigree, people in power, and the smart people who probably got merit-based scholarships. And since the actors are people who weren't quote-unquote smart enough to get a scholarship, they get low blue-collar jobs anyway, even with a degree. But this time, they also have to pay the burden of a loan. Even if the amount of the loan adapts to your income, this means that you'll always have to live paycheck to paycheck your whole life, considering the disparity of the cost of a degree and the cash flowing in your account. It's just the same thing as status quo. If you want student loans to work, Indonesia needs to have systemic reforms first. Moving on to my argument, I'm going to be positing to you one argument today: why Indonesia's government is incapable of upholding a student loan program. First, let's take a look at the likelihood of this program catering the middle class as what proposition has championed. Indonesia works as a democracy where people need to elect governments. This framework gives our bureaucracy one main incentive: to garner as much votes as possible in elections by pleasing the majority of Indonesia's demographic. Take a guess on which stratification level takes up Indonesia's population. The lower income ones. This is why the middle class didn't get this privilege to get subsidies, exactly just like what Prime Minister said. There isn't a difference from this program with other ones that she said weren't enough in the first place, simply because the government's main incentive is to please the people so that they can get re-elected in the next election. Secondly, even if you do cater towards the middle class, the longevity and effectiveness of this will still be flawed. Why? I'm going to be posing to you 3 layers of analysis here. First layer of analysis. In status quo, the government is struggling immensely with finances. Lots of competition budgets are even cut because of the current geopolitical conditions and budget constraints from new programs like MBG, etc. The government can't afford to take on another program that needs money, especially since getting money in return from this is very unlikely from my analysis in the responses that these people in the middle income classes are just going to be in a circle of debt simply because of the high oversaturated job market itself. Even if the money did return from these middle class people who got these low income jobs, it would come back gradually in really small amounts. Hence, the government needs to wait for a really long time to actually get a lot of this money, their money back back in their APBN. But then, second layer of analysis, the government has a lot on their plate currently. When you try to force student loans into their programs without actually taking into account on what will happen in the future, the management and check and balance of these kinds of programs will most likely be minimum, simply because the government has already a lot of programs right now and they need to cater attention towards these programs. Especially, another thing is the fact that currently there is an unstable geopolitical condition, which means that the government also needs to focus on conditions like that. Hence means that the attention the government can give towards this program cannot be maximum or optimal. Hence, especially since Indonesia is a developing country, which most developing countries usually have corrupt, unstable internal governments because it's relatively new, it means that you can't get this much of check and balance. Hence, you can't really know how this is going to actually work efficiently or not. But then, last layer of analysis. When you try to cater to classes that have quote-unquote adequate conditions, i.e. the middle class, the lower class will retaliate by feeling treated unequally and having a mindset that their class is more urgent. You get demagogic protests from this saturated class in society simply because the lower income class usually act from emotional and from what they see prospectively, and humans innately are egotistical creatures that want to have their own class supported either way. But then, the impact of this is dire. Firstly, the direct retaliation of the lower class, and the inefficiency of student loans give even more distress to the government, which in the end gives more political instability in and of itself of the country. What happens when you have political instability? It means that the government needs more funding. When the government is in dire need of money, or even when they're in dire need of money because of the funding they need for this program in the first place, they're going to tax more. Again, the ones who get hit from this are the middle class, who still need to pay tax towards the government. Hence, they won't really get any much benefit from this program. But then also, lastly, government spending their APBN irrationally also means less redistribution to the lower and middle class that proposition wanted to protect. Here's the weighing. This speech isn't about why status quo can provide better than this, but rather about why proposition makes status quo worse. We do agree that we need to help the education system, but the student loans isn't the solution. At the very least, private companies and NGOs in status quo are handing out more scholarships day by day for the credibility of their companies, and we think that that can be enough compared to creating internal instability that in the end trickles down to harming the people themselves. Judge, we beg you to vote for opposition.